Hey guys. Tonight, let's do something very low stress. No battles. No screaming peasants. No dramatic executions. Just you, a dim screen, maybe a fan humming in the background, and several extremely wealthy Renaissance people quietly ruining their skin, teeth, posture, and long-term health in the name of beauty. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lower the volume just a bit. Let your eyes relax. And let's gently drift back to Renaissance Europe. A time of art, rebirth, culture, and truly unhinged fashion decisions. Now, when we say Renaissance beauty, we usually imagine elegant paintings, smooth pale faces, graceful gowns, perfectly styled hair. What those paintings don't show is the lead, the mercury, the rotting teeth, and the fact that most of these people smelled aggressively bad under all that fabric. But let's not judge too harshly. They were doing their best, with extremely limited medical knowledge, and an impressive amount of confidence. We'll start, naturally, with skin. Because Renaissance beauty standards were very clear about one thing. The paler you were, the better. Pale skin meant you didn't work outside. It meant you weren't a farmer. It meant you had servants. And possibly several emotionally distant tutors. Sun-kissed was not the goal. Sun-damaged peasant was. So how did you get pale in a world without sunscreen, umbrellas, or SPF anything? You used white lead makeup, also known as cerose, which is exactly as bad as it sounds. Cerose was made by exposing lead to vinegar fumes until it formed a white crust. This paste was then smeared generously across the face. Sometimes the neck. Sometimes the chest. Sometimes everything that could be seen in public. It gave a smooth, ghostly glow. It also slowly poisoned you. Lead caused hair loss, skin cracking, neurological issues, and eventual death. But very slowly. Which meant people rarely connected the dots. If your face started cracking and flaking, you simply added more makeup. If your hair fell out, wigs existed. If you felt tired, sick, or confused, well, life was hard. Could be anything. Queen Elizabeth I was a devoted fan of cerose. She layered it on thick. Very thick. Especially after smallpox left scars on her face. And honestly, fair enough. She was a queen. She had an image to maintain. She just also happened to be coating herself in long-term toxicity. Her makeup became so heavy that it sometimes cracked when she smiled. Which is a very Renaissance problem to have. Now, eyebrows. Or rather, the lack of them. High foreheads were incredibly fashionable. The bigger the forehead, the more intelligent and refined you supposedly looked. So women plucked their hairlines back. Sometimes inches back. They also removed eyebrows entirely. No brows. No lashes. Just a smooth, uninterrupted stretch of pale skin. This wasn't subtle grooming. This was architectural. Some women even shaved the front of their heads and wore decorative veils to show off their forehead. Because nothing says beauty like looking mildly surprised at all times. Hair itself was another obsession. Blonde hair, specifically. Natural blondes were rare in Southern Europe. So people improvised. Hair was lightened using lemon juice, vinegar, saffron, and sunlight. Women would sit outside for hours wearing special hats with no crown. So the sun could bake their hair while their face stayed shaded. This was essentially slow cooking your scalp. But it worked. Kind of. The hair often turned brassy, brittle, and dry. But again, wigs existed. And everyone was doing it. So it was fine. Perfume was also everywhere. And for good reason. Bathing was inconsistent. Public bathhouses existed, but they were increasingly associated with disease, immorality, and people having too much fun. So many elites avoided frequent bathing. Instead, they masked odors with layers. Layers of clothing. Layers of perfume. Layers of scented oils. Perfume wasn't just about smelling nice. It was believed to protect against disease. Bad smells were thought to cause illness. So if you smelled flowers, you were probably safe. This is why people carried pomanders, small balls filled with spices, herbs, and resins. They'd sniff them in crowded places. Especially during plagues. It didn't help. But it felt proactive. Clothing, meanwhile, was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Renaissance fashion was not comfortable. But it was extremely serious. For women, the silhouette mattered more than comfort, breathing, or spinal alignment. Corsets were used to shape the torso into a narrow cone. This wasn't about cleavage yet. That comes later. This was about posture and control. A properly dressed woman stood straight. Moved carefully. Sat slowly. The corset enforced this physically. Like a polite medieval supervisor wrapped around your ribs. Some corsets were stiffened with whalebone or wood. Others were reinforced with metal. You weren't meant to bend much. Or breathe deeply. Or eat large meals. Which honestly fit the era's aesthetic of quiet suffering. Skirts were enormous. Multiple layers. Heavy fabrics. In colder climates, this helped. In warmer climates, less so. Underneath, women wore linen shifts that absorbed sweat. These were rarely washed. But again, linen was breathable. So everyone pretended it was hygienic. Men, meanwhile, were not exactly comfortable either. Renaissance men loved structure. Puffed sleeves. Broad shoulders. Tiny waists. Doublets were padded. Hoses were tight. Very tight. And then there was the codpiece. The codpiece began as a practical solution, extra fabric to cover a gap between hose. But fashion took over. Cod pieces grew larger and larger. And then, ridiculous. They were padded, decorated, sometimes jewel-encrusted. This was not subtle masculinity. This was aggressive confidence sewn directly onto the body. It said, yes, I am powerful. And yes, I want you to notice. Children were dressed just as elaborately. Because childhood was not really a concept yet. Small boys wore dresses until a certain age. Then suddenly switched to miniature adult clothing. Girls wore corsets very young. To train the body. Comfort was not a concern. Appearance was character. Now let's gently float over to skincare again. Because Renaissance people had opinions. Smooth skin was everything. Wrinkles were failure. So they used creams made from animal fat, egg whites, honey, vinegar, and sometimes mercury. Mercury was used to treat acne. It did remove pimples. It also damaged nerves and organs. But clear skin was clear skin. Lip color came from crushed insects, plants, or minerals. Rouge was applied heavily. Because pale skin with flushed cheeks suggested youth and health. Ironically, many of these products caused irritation, which increased redness, which looked fashionable. So the damage helped the aesthetic. A very efficient system. Teeth were another situation entirely. White teeth were admired. But sugar consumption was rising fast among elites. Teeth rotted. Breath suffered. To fix this, people cleaned their teeth with cloths, powders, and abrasive mixtures. Some used crushed coral. Others used salt or charcoal. This wore down enamel. But hey, at least you were trying. Blackened teeth even became fashionable in some regions. Especially in England. Queen Elizabeth I's teeth were famously dark. Partly from sugar. Partly from cosmetics. So dark teeth became aspirational. Which is a reminder that beauty standards are always a little arbitrary. And finally, posture. Renaissance beauty demanded stillness. Grace. Control. You didn't sprawl. You didn't slump. You didn't rush. You moved slowly. Carefully. As if being watched. Because you probably were. Fashion enforced behavior. And behavior enforced hierarchy. The clothes were uncomfortable by design. They reminded you who you were. And where you stood. So as we drift here at the end of part 1, imagine a candlelit room. Heavy fabrics. Scented air. A noble woman sitting perfectly still. Lead on her face. Corset tight. Hairline shaved back. Smelling faintly of roses and vinegar. She looks beautiful. According to the rules of her time. And slightly miserable. Also according to the rules of her time. In part 2, we'll ease further into the Renaissance mirror. And talk about extreme grooming habits, body hair paranoia, and why everyone was quietly terrified of aging. But for now, just rest, and let the powdered world gently fade into sleep. Alright. Welcome back. If you drifted off for a bit, that's perfect. That means it's working. Let's gently pick up where we left off. Still in the Renaissance. Still surrounded by heavy fabrics, faint perfume, and people trying very hard not to look their actual age. Because aging was the enemy. Wrinkles were not wisdom. They were failure. They were time winning. And Renaissance elites did not like losing to time. Let's start with hair again. Not the glamorous part. The stressful part. Hair loss was common. Very common. Between lead makeup, poor nutrition, tight headwear, and constant styling, hairlines retreated fast. For both men and women. Men lost hair early. Women lost hair quietly. Wigs became the solution. Wigs were everywhere. Expensive wigs. Cheap wigs. Wigs made from human hair, horsehair, goat hair, whatever was available. Some wigs were powdered to maintain that pale aesthetic. Which meant more powder. More residue. More scalp irritation. And wigs were rarely washed. Because water was suspicious. So lice moved in. Comfortably. It was normal to scratch your head constantly. Not discreet scratching. Just scratching. Wig stands existed not just for storage, but to let bugs crawl out. Sometimes small brushes were used specifically for removing lice from wigs. This was not embarrassing. This was routine maintenance. Eyebrows, meanwhile, remained unpopular. Eyebrows suggested expression. Expression suggested emotion. Emotion suggested instability. So brows stayed thin or non-existent. Some women even painted faint eyebrow shapes higher on the forehead. So their expressions looked permanently calm. Or distant. Or vaguely unimpressed. Which, honestly, matched the era's energy. Body hair was another obsession. Hair anywhere other than the head was suspicious. Women removed body hair using tweezers, pumice stones, or caustic pastes. These pastes often burned the skin. But smoothness was worth the pain. Men also groomed extensively. Beards came and went with fashion. A beard could signal wisdom, or military strength, or religious seriousness. But an unfashionable beard was just messy. So men shaved carefully, with sharp blades. No safety guards. No mirrors like ours. Cuts were common. Infections followed. But again, everyone accepted this as normal. Now let's talk about weight. Because Renaissance beauty had opinions. Plumpness suggested wealth. But not too much. Thinness suggested illness. But not too thin. The ideal body was softly rounded. Fed, but controlled. Food abundance was status. But overeating was morally suspicious. So elites ate rich foods. And then quietly worried about it. Diets existed. Sort of. Fasting was popular. Partly religious. Partly aesthetic. Some women practiced extreme fasting, framed as piety. But it conveniently maintained slenderness. This was praised, encouraged, and sometimes deadly. Doctors often advised moderation, which meant different things to different people. One doctor might recommend wine for health. Another might warn against it. Everyone agreed on one thing, though. Balance was key. No one knew what that meant. But it sounded good. Aging signs were fought aggressively. Wrinkles were softened with creams. Gray hair was dyed. Hair dye recipes included walnut shells, ashes, sulfur, and lead-based mixtures. Yes. Let again. Gray hair was not dignified. It was weakness. So people died until their scalp protested. And then they died more. Skin sagging was disguised with posture, clothing, and strategic accessories. High collars hid neck wrinkles. Ruffs framed the face dramatically, distracting from everything else. Ruffs, by the way, were those large pleated collars you've seen in portraits. They were starched. Heavily starched. Sometimes so stiff they limited head movement. You couldn't turn easily. You couldn't eat easily. You definitely couldn't relax. But you looked important. And importance was the goal. Let's drift into cosmetics again. Because things get quietly absurd here. Makeup wasn't just for women. Men used powders, rouge, skin lighteners, especially at court. Looking pale and refined was gender neutral. The difference was subtlety. Men pretended not to try. Women were expected to try, but not look like they tried. This delicate balance caused stress. Too much makeup suggested vanity. Too little suggested neglect. So women applied makeup carefully. And then blamed good genetics. Nails were also a concern. Long nails suggested you didn't work. But too long suggested you didn't do anything at all. So nails were shaped neatly. Cleaned with cloths. Sometimes stained with oils. Hands were displayed deliberately. In portraits. In gestures. Hands told stories. Scarred hands meant labor. Smooth hands meant privilege. So gloves were worn often. Not just for warmth, but for protection. Perfumed gloves were especially popular. They smelled nice, and masked other smells. Some gloves were scented so heavily they caused headaches. But headaches were preferable to being thought unclean. Cleanliness itself was complicated. Bathing too often was believed to weaken the body. Open pores let in disease. so people washed selectively. Hands, face, maybe feet. Full baths were rare. Special occasions. Clothing absorbed dirt instead. Layers protected skin from the world. Undergarments were changed more often than outerwear, which was considered sufficient. The concept of daily bathing simply didn't exist yet. Now let's gently float into posture and movement again. Renaissance beauty wasn't just appearance. It was performance. How you stood. How you walked. How you sat. Women practiced controlled movements. Small steps. Lowered eyes. Men practiced deliberate gestures. Measured confidence. Dancing was training. Not just entertainment. Court dances taught posture, balance, and restraint. They taught you how to exist gracefully in public. Children learned this early. Very early. A noble child was watched constantly. Corrected constantly. Slouching was corrected. Fidgeting discouraged. Your body was shaped by expectation. Now, let's talk about fashion trends changing. Because they did. Constantly. 1 year, wide sleeves. Next year, narrow. 1 decade, dark colors. Next, bright. Keeping up was expensive. And stressful. Outdated clothing signaled decline. Or poverty. Or both. So nobles spent heavily on clothes. Even when it strained finances. Debt was common. Very common. Looking rich mattered more than being rich. And this pressure was exhausting. People worried constantly about appearance. About aging. About relevance. About gossip. Mirrors existed, but were imperfect. Distorted. So you relied on others' reactions. A compliment mattered. A raised eyebrow lingered. Beauty wasn't just personal. It was social currency. And it faded. Slowly. Relentlessly. Which is why so many Renaissance elites chased youth with such desperation. They powdered. They painted. They plucked. They starved. They layered. All to freeze time just a little longer. And in paintings, it worked. Art softened reality. Idealized faces. Smoothed skin. The portraits we see are generous. Behind them were real people. With real discomfort. Real anxiety. Real mirrors showing cracks. So as we reach the end of part 2, imagine another quiet scene. A nobleman adjusting his ruff. A noblewoman touching up powder by candlelight. Both pretending they're not tired. Not aging. Not worried. They are beautiful. According to the rules. And very human. According to everything else. In part 3, we'll drift further. Into extreme fashion trends, status symbols gone too far, and why Renaissance beauty often prioritized symbolism over basic survival. But for now, stay still, breathe slow, and let the quiet pressure of perfection gently fade into sleep. Hey guys! Tonight, let's slow things way down. No urgency. No cliffhangers. Just a soft drift back through time. So dim the lights. Put the phone down somewhere it can't fall on your face. And let your breathing settle into something unambitious. Because tonight, we're going to ancient Egypt. Not the loud, dramatic Egypt with curses and collapsing tombs. But the quieter one. The one full of incense, slow rituals, bored gods, and people who were, let's say, very comfortable altering their consciousness. Ancient Egypt is usually presented as rigid, serious, monumental. But beneath all that stone and symbolism was a culture that was surprisingly relaxed about getting a little lifted. Not chaotic. Not reckless. Just calmly intoxicated. In a ceremonial, spiritually justified way. And honestly, of course they were. Let's ease into it. Egyptian life was deeply religious. Every action had meaning. Every god had opinions. Every day required balance. This balance was called ma'at. Order. Harmony. Cosmic calm. And sometimes, maintaining cosmic calm meant ingesting substances that made the gods feel closer. Or the sun feel warmer. Or reality feel just a bit softer around the edges. Now, alcohol first. Because beer was basically water. The Nile was generous. But not always clean. Beer was safer than water. And beer was everywhere. Children drank it. Workers drank it. Priests drank it. The gods were literally offered it. This wasn't modern beer. It was thick, grainy, low alcohol, but consumed constantly. And yes, people got drunk. Festivals were especially enthusiastic about this. The festival of drunkenness was a real thing, dedicated to the goddess Hathor. Hathor was the goddess of joy, love, music, dance, and also destruction when she felt like it. According to myth, Hathor once went on a violent rampage. The gods stopped her by tricking her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood. She drank it. She got drunk. She calmed down. Lesson learned. So every year, people drank heavily in her honor. Because nothing says devotion like collective intoxication. Participants would drink until they passed out. This was considered spiritual. Not embarrassing. Priests encouraged it. Because altered states meant closer contact with the divine. Now, beer was just the beginning. Let's float gently into plants. Egyptians were excellent botanists. They catalogued plants carefully. Medicinally. Ritually. recreationally. One of the most famous was the blue lotus. The blue lotus flower wasn't just decorative. It was mildly psychoactive. When steeped in wine or beer, it produced a calming, euphoric effect. Not wild hallucinations. Just relaxation. Dreaminess. A sense that everything was fine. Blue lotus appears everywhere in Egyptian art. Held to noses. Worn as crowns. Floating on water. This was not coincidence. It was used in rituals, funerals, feasts. The elite loved it. Because of course they did. Imagine reclining on cushions, drinking lotus-infused wine, listening to music, while servants fan you. Very spiritual, very respectable, and very effective. Now let's talk about opium. Quietly. Because it was there. Poppy plants were known. Their properties understood. Opium was used medically. Pain relief. Sedation. But it wasn't just for injuries. It appeared in religious contexts, especially connected to dreams. Egyptians valued dreams deeply. Dreams were messages. From gods. From the dead. From the universe. If substances helped dreams become more vivid, well, that was helpful. Temples even had sleep chambers. People would ingest substances, lie down, and wait for divine dreams. This wasn't casual drug use. This was structured, ritualized, and socially acceptable. Now, priests. Egyptian priests were interesting. They shaved their bodies completely, bathed frequently, followed strict purity rules, and then performed rituals while mildly intoxicated. Not sloppy. Just altered enough to feel connected. Some rituals required trance states. Chanting. Music. Repetition. Substances helped with this. Again, this was controlled. Intentional. Nobody was running around yelling. It was calm. Slow. Measured. Which fits the vibe. Now let's drift over to the elites. Pharaohs were gods. Or at least half gods. Their experiences mattered. They were surrounded by luxury. Music. Perfume. Food. And yes, intoxicants. Wine was imported. Expensive. Status heavy. Wine jars were labeled with vintage years and quality notes. Some pharaohs preferred specific blends because taste matters. Wine was stronger than beer, reserved for the wealthy, and often infused. Blue lotus again. Herbs. Resins. This wasn't about escaping reality. It was about enhancing it. Now, let's gently consider medical uses. Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced. Doctors prescribed substances carefully. Pain, opium, anxiety, herbal mixtures, insomnia, sedatives. They didn't see mind-altering effects as bad. They saw them as tools. The body was mechanical. The soul was divine. If substances helped align them, great. Now, was everyone constantly high? No. This wasn't a non-stop festival. Daily life was structured. Work happened. Farming happened. But during rituals, during festivals, during spiritual moments, altered states were welcomed, encouraged. Now let's softly talk about incense. Incense was everywhere. Burned constantly. Made from resins like frankincense and myrrh. These had subtle psychoactive effects when inhaled. Relaxing. Grounding. Temples were thick with smoke. Walking into one was already mind-altering. Add chanting. Music. Heat. You didn't need much else. The environment itself shifted perception. Now, let's pause gently on social perception. Getting intoxicated wasn't shameful. Losing control was. Balance mattered. Too much indulgence was frowned upon. Moderation was praised. Even festivals had structure. Drinking had purpose. Context. You didn't just get drunk alone. That would be odd. You drank collectively. Ritually. Now, let's talk about death. Because Egypt loved preparing for it. Funerary rituals included substances. The dead were offered beer, wine, and plants. So they wouldn't be deprived in the afterlife. Some mummies even show traces of substances. Because eternity should be comfortable. And possibly relaxing. Now, here's the contrast. Modern narratives paint ancient societies as primitive. Rigid. Superstitious. But Egypt understood something quietly profound. That consciousness matters. That perception shapes experience. That rituals work better when people feel something. So they curated experiences. Carefully. Slowly. And yes, with chemical assistance. Not chaos. Not addiction. Just enhancement. So as we come to the end of part 1, imagine a temple at dusk. Incense drifting. Low chanting. A priest sipping lotus wine. The gods feel close. The world feels steady. Time slows. No rush. No panic. Just presence. In part 2, we'll float deeper into specific gods, specific rituals, and the elite individuals who lean very hard into these practices. Sometimes a little too hard. But for now, rest. Let the Nile flow quietly. And let the ancient calm carry you gently toward sleep. All right. Welcome back. If you nodded off somewhere between lotus wine and temple incense, that's ideal. Let's just gently slip back into ancient Egypt again. Same slow pace. Same warm air. Same people doing surprisingly mellow things in the name of the gods. Now that we've set the scene, let's float a little closer to the gods themselves. Because if humans were getting comfortably altered, the gods were absolutely on board. Ancient Egyptian gods were not distant, abstract forces. They were emotional, moody, easily offended, and very responsive to offerings. And some of their favorite offerings were intoxicating. We already met Hathor, the goddess of joy, music, love, and casual destruction when bored. Hathor loved wine. She loved beer. She loved music loud enough to vibrate the soul. Her temples were places of celebration, not quiet contemplation. Priestesses danced. Musicians played endlessly. Drinking happened openly. Hathor was associated with pleasure. And pleasure was sacred. Which is refreshing, honestly. Now let's drift over to Osiris. Osiris was the god of death, rebirth, and the afterlife. Very serious on paper. Very green-skinned in art. But his rituals often involved substances meant to ease transitions. Funerary rites included incense, wine, and herbal mixtures. Not just for the dead. For the living participants. Mourning was exhausting. Ritual grief took energy. Substances softened the emotional edges. They helped people feel connected. To Osiris. To the departed. To the eternal cycle. This wasn't numbness. It was guided emotion. Now, let's talk about Thoth. Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, magic, and knowledge. Basically the intellectual of the pantheon. Scribes worshipped him. Priests invoked him during complex rituals. And interestingly, Thoth was closely associated with dream interpretation. Dreams mattered deeply. And substances that enhanced dreams were helpful. Temple dream incubation again. People came seeking answers. They fasted. They ingested herbs. They slept in sacred spaces. Dreams came. Or at least, something came. And that was enough. Now let's gently float toward the pharaohs themselves. Because if anyone had access to everything, it was them. Pharaohs were divine intermediaries. Their bodies mattered. Their experiences mattered. Their pleasure mattered. Wine was a royal staple. Royal tombs contain massive wine collections. Carefully labeled. Some jars even note flavor. Sweet. Strong. Smooth. Which suggests tasting sessions. Opinions. Preferences. Pharaohs weren't just drinking to drink. They were connoisseurs. And they drank often. Royal banquets were long affairs. Food. Music. Entertainment. Wine flowed steadily. Now add Blue Lotus. Elite banquets often included lotus blossoms floating in cups. Guests sniffed them, chewed them, steeped them. This wasn't accidental decoration. It was mood-setting. Guests reclined, relaxed, let time stretch. And this was normal. Now let's talk about one specific pharaoh energy. Amenhotep III. He ruled during a time of extreme wealth, stability, luxury. He loved pleasure, music, festivals. He built temples to Hathor, held massive celebrations. Records describe long festivals filled with drinking, dancing, ritual indulgence. This wasn't decadence by accident. It was intentional. A happy pharaoh meant cosmic balance. Now, his son, Akhenaten. Akhenaten was different. He rejected many traditional gods, focused on Aten, the sun disk. He changed art styles, moved the capital, upset everyone. But even Akhenaten understood altered states. Sun worship involved intense heat, light, meditation. Substances still appeared in rituals, just reframed. And his wife, Nefertiti, absolutely participated in elite ritual culture. Lotus imagery surrounds her constantly. Now let's gently drift into the priesthood again. Priests lived strange lives. They were clean, strict, controlled. And then, periodically, they let go. Ritual intoxication was scheduled, planned, before ceremonies, before festivals. Not constant, but purposeful. A priest in trance was closer to the divine. Visions mattered. Oracles mattered. Substances assisted. Now let's talk about medicine again, because it blends quietly into everything. Egyptian medical papyri list dozens of recipes. Many include plants with psychoactive effects, not labeled as mind-altering, labeled as calming, sleep-inducing, heart-settling. Mental health wasn't separate from physical health. Anxiety was treated. Sadness was treated. Sometimes with herbs. Sometimes with rituals. Often together. Now, everyday people, farmers, laborers, they drank beer daily. Not strong, but constant. After long days in the sun, beer was relief. Festivals were the exception. During festivals, even common people drank heavily. Drunkenness during festivals was tolerated, even expected, as long as it was contained, as long as it honored the gods. Now let's gently consider the darker side. Quietly, overindulgence did exist. Texts warn against excess. Drunkenness outside ritual was criticized. People who lost control were mocked. Balance again. Egypt loved balance. Even pleasure needed limits. Now let's float into art again. Egyptian art shows people holding cups constantly, smelling flowers, leaning. These are not static poses. These are relaxed bodies. This wasn't accidental. The elite ideal was composed calm, not rigid tension. Substances helped maintain that ideal. Now, something subtle. Egyptians didn't separate spiritual and recreational experiences. Modern categories didn't exist. If something made you feel closer to the gods, it was spiritual. If it made rituals effective, it was necessary. Pleasure and holiness overlapped comfortably. Now imagine an evening along the Nile. The sun setting. Water reflecting gold. Music playing softly. People drinking. Laughing quietly. This wasn't rebellion. This was culture. So as we drift toward the end of part 2, remember that ancient Egypt wasn't stiff. It wasn't joyless. It was structured, intentional, and surprisingly relaxed about consciousness. They didn't fear altered states. They respected them. They didn't chase chaos. They curated calm. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything down. No rush. No drama. Just a soft drift into a world where people wore 6 layers of clothing and still thought about sex constantly. So dim the lights. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. And let's wander gently into the Renaissance. A time of rebirth. Of art. Of philosophy. Of human curiosity returning after a very long medieval nap. And with curiosity came desire. Lots of it. The Renaissance liked to pretend it was serious, moral, controlled. It absolutely was not. Behind all the marble statues and religious paintings, people were writing love letters, sneaking into bedrooms, collecting banned books, and quietly panicking about their own urges. Which makes them very relatable. Let's start with the basic problem. The Renaissance was obsessed with self-control. Restraint was virtue. Discipline was holiness. But the Renaissance was also obsessed with the human body. Painters studied it. Sculptors celebrated it. Poets described it in exhausting detail. Everyone was staring at naked statues, while insisting they felt nothing. Of course they did. Love in the Renaissance was complicated, because marriage was rarely about love. Marriage was business. Alliances. Dowries. Land. Romantic love was suspicious, dangerous, distracting, potentially sinful. So where did romance go? Into poetry. Into secret letters. Into glances held too long at banquets. and into books that were absolutely not supposed to exist. Let's float gently toward the elites first. Because they had the time and the privacy to make everything more dramatic. Noble marriages were arranged early, sometimes when the bride and groom were still children. Affection was optional, often absent, so emotional needs found other outlets. Mistresses were common, widely tolerated, as long as discretion was maintained. Kings had mistresses. Dukes had mistresses. Even popes had mistresses. Yes. Popes. We'll come back to that. Now, women were expected to be faithful. Men, less so. This double standard was very comfortable for men. Very stressful for women. Women's sexuality was heavily controlled, guarded, monitored. Virginity was currency. Reputation was fragile. One rumor could ruin everything, which made secret love intensely risky, and therefore intensely appealing. Love letters became an art form. Carefully written, carefully hidden, often coded, using classical references. I burn for you like Dido burned for Aeneas, which sounds poetic, and also very dangerous, because Dido did not end well. Now let's talk about books, because books were trouble. The printing press changed everything. Suddenly ideas traveled faster than gossip. And some ideas were not approved. Forbidden books circulated quietly. Love poetry. Erotic stories. Classical texts discussing desire openly. The church tried to control this. The index of forbidden books listed what you shouldn't read, which, naturally, made everyone want to read them more. Banned books were copied secretly, hidden behind respectable covers. A religious text on the outside. Something much more interesting inside. Of course it was. One popular forbidden text was Ovid's Ars Amatoria, a Roman guide to love, seduction, and affairs. It was practical, clever, and deeply inappropriate by Renaissance standards. People read it anyway. Quietly. Late at night. Probably by candlelight. Now let's drift to the church itself. Because Renaissance clergy were human. Very human. Priests were supposed to be celibate. Many were not. Monks wrote love poetry. Nuns exchanged passionate letters. Some convents became surprisingly social places. Women were sent there for safety, or convenience, or because their families didn't want to pay a dowry. They brought emotions with them. And books. Forbidden books made their way into convents too, which led to feelings. The church tried to clamp down. Rules tightened. Walls grew metaphorically thicker. But desire didn't disappear. It just learned to whisper. Now let's gently float to Florence. Because Florence was a lot. Florence loved art. Florence loved beauty. Florence loved pretending it was morally superior while doing the opposite. Artists were surrounded by nude models, classical myths, patrons who wanted sensual imagery, but holy enough to hang in public. So Venus appeared as allegory. Naked bodies were symbolic. Everyone understood the symbolism and enjoyed it. Lorenzo de' Medici encouraged art and poetry, also through lavish parties. His court was refined, educated, and full of romantic intrigue. Love affairs bloomed quietly. Married nobles fell in love with poets. Artists fell in love with patrons. Patrons fell in love with themselves, which was common. Now, let's pause gently on women writers. Because despite restrictions, some women wrote openly about desire. Carefully. Poetically. Gaspara Stampa wrote passionate love poetry about unrequited love. She didn't hide longing. She leaned into it, which made people uncomfortable. Women were supposed to inspire desire, not express it. But she did anyway. And people read her work, sometimes secretly. Now let's talk about censorship. Books weren't just banned for erotic content. They were banned for ideas. Ideas about love outside marriage. Ideas about pleasure not tied to reproduction. Ideas that suggested humans might enjoy things for their own sake. Terrifying. So people hid books, shared them quietly, passed them hand to hand. Reading became intimate, private, almost rebellious. Now let's float into everyday life. Not just elites. Even merchants and artisans experienced this tension. Public morality was strict. Private behavior, flexible. Brothels existed. Regulated. Taxed. Prostitution was considered a necessary evil. Better than uncontrolled adultery, apparently. Cities maintained brothels officially. Which is very honest, in a way. Men were expected to visit. Women were expected not to talk about it. Again, very balanced. Now, emotions. People fell in love. Hard. And often unhappily. Unrequited love was romanticized. Suffering for love was noble. Poems praised longing. Pain. Waiting. Actually being happy in love was less interesting. Drama sold better. Which is why so much Renaissance literature is about desire that cannot be fulfilled. Forbidden love. Social barriers. Moral conflict. Everyone loved reading about it, even as they pretended not to. Now let's drift toward royal households. Because kings had problems too. Henry VIII is later, but his emotional chaos had roots in Renaissance ideals. Kings were raised believing they deserved love, admiration, obedience. When they didn't get it, they spiraled. Affairs multiplied. Marriages cracked. Love became entitlement. And entitlement rarely ends peacefully. But we won't rush there. For now, let's stay in the quieter Renaissance, where desire was constant, but expression was controlled, where books were hidden, letters were burned after reading, glances mattered, where everyone was thinking, and few were speaking. So as we reach the end of part 1, imagine a quiet room, a single candle. Someone opens a book they shouldn't have. Reads slowly. Feel something stir. They close it again. Hide it carefully. Tomorrow, they'll attend church. Smile politely. Behave correctly. But tonight, their thoughts wander. But for now, rest. Let the forbidden pages close softly. And let the quiet tension of the Renaissance lull you gently into sleep. Hey guys. Tonight, let's slow everything down. No urgency. No loud history. Just a gentle slide into a world where people made permanent life choices. With hand-poked needles. Because that felt reasonable at the time. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders sink a little. Tonight we're going to Edo, Japan. Not the dramatic sword-clashing version. The quieter one. The one full of wooden houses, flickering lanterns, strict social rules. And people calmly deciding to cover their entire bodies in ink. Because of course they did. Tattooing in Edo, Japan, Irizumi, was not trendy. It wasn't rebellious in the modern sense. It wasn't casual. It was slow. Painful. Expensive. Socially complicated. And deeply meaningful. Which already tells you something about the people who chose it. Now, Edo, Japan was structured. Very structured. Everyone had a place. Samurai. Farmers. Artisans. Merchants. Rules were everywhere. Clothing laws. Behavior laws. Sumptuary laws telling you what colors you were allowed to wear. Based on how important you were supposed to be. Spoiler, most people were not supposed to be important. And when you live in a world like that, self-expression finds creative ways to escape. Sometimes, under the clothes. Tattooing had existed in Japan long before Edo. Ancient. Spiritual. Sometimes decorative. But by the Edo period, tattoos took on very specific meanings. And some very awkward baggage. Let's start with the problem. Tattoos were used as punishment. Criminals were marked permanently. Lines on the arm. Symbols on the face. These were not decorative. They were social death. A tattooed criminal could not hide their past. Everywhere they went, it followed. which meant tattoos became associated with shame. So naturally, people decided to reclaim them. Because humans are like that. Now let's float gently into Edo cities. Tokyo was called Edo then. It was crowded, busy, full of fire hazards. Which brings us to firefighters. Edo firefighters were intense. Fires were constant. Buildings were wooden. Wind existed. Firefighters risked their lives regularly. They were admired, feared, romanticized, and heavily tattooed. Firefighters embraced full-body tattoos, bold designs, mythical creatures, heroes, dragons, deities. These tattoos weren't visible in daily life. They were hidden under clothing. But during fires, jackets came off. And suddenly, there was the art. This wasn't about showing off constantly. It was about identity, courage, group loyalty. Also, a little intimidation. Because why not double down? Now let's talk about the people who got tattooed. Mostly townspeople, artisans, laborers, firefighters. Not samurai. Samurai were complicated. They valued honor, tradition, appearances. Tattooing wasn't forbidden for them outright, but it was frowned upon. Samurai were already marked by their status. They didn't need ink, which meant tattoos became the language of the non-elite. And that made them powerful. Now let's talk about the art itself. Edo tattoos were not quick. There were no machines. No buzzing needles. Tattooing was done by hand, using bamboo or metal needles. Tapped slowly into the skin. Hour after hour. Session after session. This could take years. Years. People committed to designs knowing they would spend months in pain. That's not impulsive behavior. That's dedication. Ink was made from charcoal-based pigments. Deep black. Rich. Colors came later. Carefully. Shading was subtle. Flow mattered. The body was treated as a canvas, not a sticker board. Designs flowed with muscles, wrapped around limbs, connected across the back. This wasn't random. Tattoo artists were skilled, respected, often trained in woodblock printing. Which brings us to books. Because of course books are involved. Woodblock prints were wildly popular in Edo, Japan. Ukiyo-e prints showed actors, heroes, mythical scenes. Some of these prints featured heavily tattooed figures. Outlaws. Folk heroes. Strong men. One story in particular changed everything. The Chinese novel Suikoden, Water Margin, was imported and adapted. It featured rebellious heroes covered in tattoos. Japanese artists illustrated these characters beautifully, dramatically. People saw them and thought, yes, that. Tattoo culture exploded. Suddenly tattoos weren't just marks. They were stories. You didn't get a tattoo because it looked cool. You got it because it meant something. A dragon for strength. A koi for perseverance. A hero for rebellion against unjust authority. These meanings weren't subtle. Now let's pause gently on pain. Pain was part of the process. Expected. Accepted. There was no anesthesia. People endured sessions quietly. Pain demonstrated resolve. Masculinity. Discipline. Complaining wasn't impressive. Enduring was. Which fits the cultural tone nicely. Now let's talk about secrecy. Despite popularity, tattoos weren't public fashion. They were hidden. Clothing laws already restricted expression. Tattoos lived beneath. Bathhouses were one of the few places tattoos were visible. Public bathing was common. And this created moments. Tattooed men bathing together. Comparing designs. Bonding. But also, tension. Because tattoos still carried criminal associations. Some bathhouses banned tattooed customers. Which meant exclusion. Again. Humans doubled down. Tattooed communities formed. Shared spaces. Shared identity. Marginalization strengthened the culture. Now let's float toward merchants. Merchants were wealthy. But low status. They had money. No respect. They couldn't dress richly. Couldn't display luxury openly. So they spent money privately. On art. On books. On tattoos. Hidden wealth. Hidden beauty. Tattoos became a quiet flex. Expensive. Time-consuming. Invisible unless revealed. Which made them even more satisfying. Now let's talk about women. Yes, women were tattooed. Not as commonly. But it happened. Some women got small tattoos. Symbols. Names. In some cases, tattoos marked romantic commitment. A lover's name. A symbol of loyalty. Which sometimes aged poorly. But that's human history. Women in entertainment districts, courtesans, sometimes had tattoos. Discreet. Personal. Again, not for display. For meaning. Now, the government. The Tokugawa shogunate liked order. Tattoos made them nervous. They associated tattoos with crime. Rebellion. Firefighters getting a little too confident. Attempts were made to discourage tattooing. Regulations tightened. But enforcement was uneven. Tattoos remained legal. But suspicious. Which only added to their appeal. Now imagine an Edo evening. Paper lanterns glowing. Wooden streets quiet. A tattoo artist prepares tools. A client sits calmly. Needles tap. Slowly. Methodically. No rush. This isn't fashion. This is ritual. And so we end part 1 here. With ink sinking slowly into skin. With identity forming quietly beneath clothing. With a society pretending not to notice. While absolutely noticing. But for now, rest. Let the tapping fade. Let the lanterns dim. And let Edo Japan carry you gently into sleep.